Hello again, and what is hip? Yeah, so I don't really usually like talking about systems that I don't have a huge fondness for, but I thought it would be interesting to talk about a system that I grew up with and was very much a part of my childhood and was very much an introduction to a lot of timeless games for me. But it was a system that I really just did not like. And let me show you something. It's the Nintendo 64, and this is my original console. As you can see, I really hated the thing. No, I did not purposely obliterate this. I remember I think I was reaching to get this out of my closet when I was younger, and something that was really heavy fell on it and just completely thrashed the thing, but it still does work, and it is my primary Nintendo 64 console, though I do not use it much. We'll put this work of art right here. As you can see, it's completely dusty and nasty and just, yeah, it's the exact representation of how I feel about the console. So yeah, I figured I'd show off my collection, and as I'm showing off, just really kind of talk about my memories with the system, because ironically I do actually have quite a significant amount of memories with this thing. And I'll start it off strong, I guess, and that's The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Now, I should say the majority of these games are the games that I've had since childhood, and pulling these out, I realized I actually had a lot more games for this system than I thought, because I do not buy Nintendo 64 games. I have zero interest in this console, and I'll get a little more into why. But I have picked up a couple throughout the years, if they're really, really cheap, or if it's something that I'm interested in, which tends to be racing games more often than not. The 64 did have an awesome library of racing games, as you'll see in just a minute. But anyway, starting off with The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. And this was not my first Zelda game. I believe my first Zelda game was actually Twilight Princess. And as I've said before, I'm 26, so I really grew up in the GameCube era. However, my family had all of the prior Nintendo consoles, and they basically gave them to me, so I had all these Nintendo consoles that I would switch out on a weekly basis pretty much in my room on my little CRT, and I would try all the games that we had. And I loved the Super Nintendo, I loved the NES, but I did not like this console. And Ocarina of Time was one of the few games that I really did enjoy. I loved Twilight Princess, and when I found out that there was a Zelda game on the 64, I had to try it, so I went to my local game store and I bought a copy of this, and yeah, played through it. And I remember thinking that it was such a cool experience, and I really liked the graphics too. I remember liking the retro look of the graphics of these things back in 2004. But I didn't enjoy it as much as Twilight Princess, and there was something about Ocarina of Time that just made me feel uncomfortable. And I talked about this briefly in the, I think the GameCube was horrifying video that I made. But this game was kind of unsettling for me, especially at that young age, and especially when you're an adult and you go into the Re-Dead temple, or the Death Temple or whatever, and you see those zombie things walking around. Really freaked me out as a kid. And the graveyard and all of that just kind of freaked me out, which doesn't make any sense, because I played through Twilight Princess no problem, but there's just something kind of cold and unsettling about Ocarina of Time. One game that I did very much enjoy was Mario Kart 64. However, I should say that even though I did enjoy this, it's one of my least favorites in the series. I did not play this that much. Again, I picked this up from my local game store back in the day, and because it was a new Mario Kart that I had never experienced before, and I really did enjoy the graphics of the console, so that the videos I saw online, you know, made me want to give it a try, and I got it, and I had a good time with it, but I did not love it. but it was still fun to invite my friends over. I had a friend, his name was Josh, and he was also very much into the retro gaming at that age, which was very hard to come by back in the early 2000s as an elementary schooler, and we would play through Mario Kart 64. So definitely some fond memories of this game. Now, Diddy Kong Racing was not a game that I had played on the Nintendo 64. I got this one very recently, actually, and in fact, I have the box here. I only got this because it was dirt cheap. The box is beat up, as you can see, but I first experienced Diddy Kong Racing on the Nintendo DS, and I had a very good time playing through that game, and so I wanted to get the original on the Nintendo 64 just to have, and also just to have another reason to play my Nintendo 64. I got this about 2 years ago, and I was just, at that point, I really just had the games from my childhood, which I didn't play anymore, so I wanted a reason to go back to this console, and this was one of the reasons why I picked up this game right here. And I did play through this, and I had a good time. But a lot of the good times from the system really does come from the racing games. Now, one thing I want to say about the 64 is that it did introduce me to a lot of titles. And in fact, one fun story is my local Hollywood Video, which was basically the equivalent to Blockbuster, they had a big Nintendo 64 section, and I always go in there and rent games. I remember renting Glover for the 64. I hated that game. I can't believe that game is getting remade. But I rented Glover, but I rented one of my favorite series, what would become one of my favorite series of all time, Paper Mario on the Nintendo 64. And I remember loving it. However, I had forgotten the name after I had returned the rental copy, and we were at a game store, and I really wanted this game, but I didn't know what the name was. Again, I was pretty young at the time, probably 2nd, 3rd grade, and I remember going up to the guy at the cash register, and I was just like trying to describe this game. I was like, it's a Mario game, and you can go into buildings, and you can fight enemies, and you can do all of these things. And the guy did not know what I was talking about. Not once did I mention anything about paper. And so he was like, you can go into buildings, do this. He's like, he must be talking about none other than Mario 64. And unfortunately, I do not know where my copy of that is, but I don't think I sold it. It's just probably lost somewhere. And so I bought a copy of Mario on the Nintendo 64, or Super Mario 64, one of the greatest games of all time. I did not enjoy Super Mario 64 that much. Now, again, keep in mind that I was technically a GameCube kid. I was a Super Nintendo NES kid too, but those were only 2D Mario games. And so my first real 3D Mario experience was none other than Super Mario Sunshine, which also happened to be my favorite 3D Mario game of all time. And so I think because I grew up with that and didn't grow up with Mario 64, going to the platforming style of Mario 64 was kind of a shock to me, and it just did not translate well. And I'm sure that if I grew up with the 64 version, I'd probably end up loving that and not loving Super Mario Sunshine. But it was just an interesting story that I'll always remember of how I got introduced to Super Mario 64, one of the greatest games of all time. And it was also another one of those unsettling games, because it was, I just remember exploring the castle and going underneath where there's that big Boo that is there and then he runs away when you get close. Always kind of freaked me out as a kid. So now we're getting into a bunch of racing games here. I have so many racing games because I love racing games on this system. I don't know why, there's just something about racing games on this system that I truly love. The first one is a relatively recent pickup, and that's Cruisin USA. I absolutely love this game. I got Cruisin Blast on the Nintendo Switch, which is an amazing racing game in its own right. But I was first introduced to the Cruisin series at my local Old Spaghetti Factory, which was a restaurant, and they had a big arcade cabinet of, I think it was Cruisin USA. It was one of the Cruisin games, and I would play that every time I went and visited the Old Spaghetti Factory. And so that's how I fell in love with the Cruisin series, and I finally picked up a copy of Cruisin USA, and I adored this game. I adored the Cruisin series. It's a super cheap game too. That's the thing with the 64s. All the racing games, for the most part, tend to be really, really affordable, and they're really quality titles. And speaking of quality titles, I have Ridge Racer 64. Now, excuse me if I'm wrong, but I do believe this is not the superior version of Ridge Racer from this era. I think the PlayStation 1 version was considered to be better, but this is the version of Ridge Racer I grew up with, and this was also my very first Ridge Racer. I found it once again at my local game store, and I think it was like $5 or $8 many, many years ago when I was young. And I had to pick it up. I also thought it was cool to have a boxed Nintendo 64 game. But I have played many hours of this. I thoroughly enjoyed my time with this. Again, the graphics I loved, and there is something really charming about the Nintendo 64 analog stick. There's just something about the way that it feels and operates when you're playing games that it almost feels analog in a way, even though, I mean, all joysticks are analog, but there's some, it's, you know, it's like listening to vinyl, you know, on the record player, you know, it's like that analog sound. It just feels like you're more in tune, or the manual stick shift of a car, you know, when people are just like, you feel more in tune with the car. It feels like that. I don't know why. But Ridge Racer 64 is a game that I love. Now, as you can see, I love racing games, and I loved racing games back then, but those can only take you so far. And I loved platforming games, I loved RPGs, and RPGs were the big one. And as many of you know, the Nintendo 64 had Quest, it had Ogre, Tactics Ogre, and maybe one other RPG, but it really didn't have any RPGs to speak of. And that was definitely one of the reasons why I just could not get into this console. I mean, you can only play racing games for so long. And so that was definitely one of the reasons why I did not enjoy this system. But one of the reasons that I did enjoy my 64, and this is probably one of my favorite games of all time, it is a spectacle, and that is Wave Race 64. I remember getting this at the Portland Retro Gaming Expo, oh geez, at least over 10 years ago, in the dollar bin. Just $1. And people were throwing out these copies, and I was glad to pick them out from the trash. And I'm so glad I did, because I love Wave Race 64. This is so much fun. It's kind of reminiscent of Hydro Thunder, which was an arcade game that I really loved and was also at that Old Spaghetti Factory I mentioned earlier. But it's not a long game, but it is so much fun. The way that everything controls feels so nice, and it's just an all-around great game. And you can still get it for pretty cheap too. And another racing game, oh my goodness, and another beat-up box. This was the first boxed Nintendo 64 game I ever bought, and this was Star Wars 1 Episode 1 Racer. I paid $8 from my game store, again, many years ago, when I was in elementary school. And once again, I loved this game, absolutely loved it. It was so much fun, and I have popped this in many times. I never got really super in-depth into it. I've never played all of the tracks, but I would replay the first several tracks over and over again. It was kind of hard for me back then, I remember, but it was still such a fun game, and I was a big Star Wars fan when I was a kid as well, and still am, but a great game nonetheless. All right. So, we'll get this last racing game out of the way. This is Mickey Speedway USA, and this is another very recent pickup within the past year or two. And I had never played this game when I was... Actually, no, I take that back. I had very vague memories of renting this from My Hollywood Video, but they were very, very vague. And I remember as I got older looking up videos of Mickey Speedway on YouTube and thinking, did I play that game? And surely enough, I remembered that I definitely did. And something about the graphics, you know, just really stood out to me. It's a very good looking game, and it's made by none other than Rare, which, you know, made Diddy Kong Racing and all those games, which were fantastic. And so I knew I had to have it. I've heard that it's very average. Once I did get it, I popped it in. I had a very good time with it. It's definitely no Mario Kart, and it's not even a Diddy Kong Racing 64, but I think it's still very charming in its own right, and it's a very beautiful looking game as well. All right, we're done with the racing games. Now we're getting on to the game that I both loved and hated, and this is one of my earliest Nintendo 64 experiences, and one of my very earliest Pokemon experiences as well. My very first Pokemon game of all time was Pokemon Emerald, and after that I believe it was Gold or Silver. And after that, it was Pokemon Stadium. And this is the copy right here. I bought these maybe last year, 2 years ago. I had sold my original copies because I sold a lot of my original Nintendo 64 games because I just did not like the system. And this game was so cool because you got to see the Pokemon in this 3D stadium arena and see all of their battle moves and stuff in 3D. It was just like watching the anime, and the announcer was super cool as well. It was very, very, how do you say, engrossing. It really brought me into the experience. I felt like I was a Pokemon trainer. However, to get the most potential out of this game, you needed to have the Nintendo 64 transfer pack to download your Pokemon from the original Pokemon Red and Yellow games into this game. Otherwise, you're left battling with the stock Pokemon in this game, which are not very good, and in the story mode you can't really get that far because they're not strong. I only had the game growing up. I did not have the transfer pack. So I would just basically replay battles with these stock Pokemon over and over again up until I got to the point where it was pretty much impossible to move on because your Pokemon were so weak. And I think this game was one of the reasons why the 64 just left a really sour taste in my mouth, because there were so many Nintendo IPs that I was seeing on the system that looked really amazing, and in many ways were doing things that were not being done on the GameCube. So it was really cool in that aspect, but there were so many limitations, like with the transfer pack on here, or with the next game we're going to be talking about, the expansion pack. So that was Pokemon Stadium, a game I loved and I hated. Another game that I really wanted to love but ultimately couldn't was The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. I have owned probably 3 copies of this game, and I have sold it numerous times. Now, the reason why this has left a sour taste in my mouth, and probably one of the main reasons why I really did not enjoy the system, is I just did not have a lot of luck with the Nintendo 64, as you can see by its physical condition. But with the transfer pack of Pokemon Stadium and the expansion pack of this, I was basically teased by Nintendo by these awesome experiences, but I was not able to play them. So with Zelda, I had an expansion pack that I bought specifically for this game from my retro gaming store when I was in elementary school. And there was something wrong either with the expansion pack or with the console itself, and I think it was actually the console itself. And basically, you would play 5 or 10 minutes and the game would freeze. And it happened with every single game that took advantage of the expansion pack. So I never really got to play more than 20 to 30 minutes of Majora's Mask at a time. And that really, really put a sour taste in my mouth, which is such a shame because I was so intrigued by Majora's Mask as a kid. There was something about the... See, it's ironic because Ocarina of Time made me feel unsettled and everything, but Majora's Mask, which is arguably a much darker game and arguably the darkest game in the Zelda series, did not unsettle me at all. It only intrigued me, but I couldn't play it. And so that really rubbed me the wrong way. I was just having all this bad luck with this system. However, I will say that the 3-day time limit on this thing really turned me off. It really freaked me out. I did not like the idea that I had a time limit to do everything. So to this day, I still have not played through Majora's Mask, which is a crime, I know. Hopefully I'll get to it one day, but still that 3-day time limit rubs me the wrong way even to this day. So this next game here is Rayman 2, The Great Escape. My very first Rayman game was, I believe it was Rayman 3 on the GameCube, and I would rent this from my local Hollywood video. I had a very good time with it. Rayman 2, I could never get into, even though it is arguably the best game in the Rayman series, or at least the 3D series. But I bought this copy for $3 back in the day. Yeah, that's, you know, take a shot every time I say that. It's extremely beat up, but I love it to death. It's such a beautiful box art. I mean, look at that, the shiny. It's embossed too, which is really cool. But yeah, I couldn't really get into this game. And at this time, I was a little older. I think I was in middle school, and I just grew out of the Nintendo 64. I really did. At this point, I was completely moved on to the GameCube, as well as fully engrossed in the Super Nintendo, and at this point the Sega Saturn and the Sega Genesis. I kind of become a Sega fanboy at this point in my life, so I moved on from that. Now these are all recent pickups. The first here is Mario Party 2, and this is cool. It's a old rental case, and it's the box that was cut up and put in here. I don't own the game. I just bought the case because it was super cheap and I thought it was cool. But I did own Mario Party 1 and Mario Party 3. I hated Mario Party 1. I loved Mario Party 4, 5, and 6 on the GameCube. Hated the first Mario Party. I had no fun with it. And I remember just thinking, man, I just got gypped out of 20 bucks or however much it was that I paid for it back then. I did also own Mario Party 3, and I had a significantly better time with Mario Party 3. But once again, I just got bored with it and I ended up selling it alongside Mario Party 1 because in my eyes Mario Party 4 through 6 were just superior in every way. And that was kind of just the ideology of the 64 for me in general. It was just an inferior GameCube, and I know that's very controversial now. And looking back, there's definitely a lot more credit I need to give this system. But for me, you also have to take into perspective how old I was and the order of events of how I experienced these consoles. It was GameCube first, then I went to NES, then Super Nintendo, and then I finally went to the 64. And at this point, I had experienced all of the 3D platforming and 3D revolutions that Nintendo put out on the GameCube first, and then I went to the 64 when it really probably should have been switched, and I think I would have had a much deeper appreciation of the console. Again, another recent pickup and another rental case, which is cool. This is Rampage 2 Universal Tour. I do have the game on the inside here. I actually haven't really played it. I just bought it because it was cool. It's an old rental case, which I thought was fun. Same thing with Dr. Mario. Another rental copy. It does have the manual. Booklet must be returned with 3 exclamation points. Again, I also haven't really played this, but it's Dr. Mario. It's the same on nearly every system. But yeah, there you have it. That is my small, but granted larger than I thought, Nintendo 64 collection. And it's such an interesting thing looking back on this system because I do not like it. I never got into it. And I truly think that is because of how I experienced, the order in which I experienced Nintendo consoles, and how by the time of the GameCube, it was the last Nintendo console that I had experienced. And I really think that was not in its favor. And especially being a GameCube kid, you know, in many ways, I think the GameCube and the Nintendo 64 are polar opposites in a lot of ways. Because with the GameCube, they took the experiments that they did with the 64, like Super Mario 64, and they tried to experiment again on top of that, almost kind of doing a, not necessarily a 180, but just going a completely different direction. And since that was where I started, I was on the other end of the sign pole compared to the Nintendo 64, and I think that was definitely the reason as to why I just could not really get into this system. But it does have its moments. The racing game catalog is wonderful, and at this point I have not captured the footage for all of these, so it'll be really interesting to go back and play all of these while I capture the footage, because I haven't played my 64 in at least a couple years. So that'll be fun, and I'm looking forward to doing that. Maybe I'll post in the comments below my experiment, or my experience in doing so. But what are your guys' opinion of the Nintendo 64? Because I know right now the Nintendo 64 is kind of the big thing. You know, it used to be the GameCube, and it still is the GameCube, but it feels like the 64 has just been on a skyrocket trajectory here in regards to its popularity. Because I know everybody just holds it in the highest regards. But yeah, what are your thoughts on this system? Do you love it? Do you hate it? Are you indifferent about it? Or are you similar to me where it's just like you just don't care about it? Not necessarily a hatred, but it's just a little blip in the Nintendo radar. Let me know in the comments below. But once again, thank you guys so much for watching. I appreciate each and every one of you. Have a good one.